The morning mist clung to the Tennessee hills like a burial shroud, and Major General George Henry Thomas knew that death would soon walk among the trees of Chickamauga Creek. It was September 18th, 1863, and the fate of the Union Army of the Cumberland hung by a thread as thin as the wisps of fog that drifted through the Georgia wilderness. Thomas adjusted his field glasses and peered through the dim light toward the Confederate positions. Somewhere in those shadowy woods, General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee was stirring to life. It was preparing for what would become one of the bloodiest encounters of the entire Civil War. The irony was not lost on Thomas that Chickamauga meant river of death in the Cherokee tongue of prophecy. That would prove all too accurate in the coming days. The previous months had seen a deadly game of chess laid across the southeastern theater. After Major General William Rosecrans had successfully maneuvered Bragg out of Tennessee through a series of brilliant flanking movements, the Confederate general had finally turned to fight, reinforced by Lieutenant General James Longstreet's seasoned corps from Virginia. Bragg now commanded nearly 70,000 men of force, roughly equal to Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland. Thomas commanded the 14th Corps, a battle-hardened collection of divisions that had proven their mettle in previous engagements. Born in Virginia, but loyal to the Union, Thomas had earned the nickname Old Reliable for his steady leadership and unflappable demeanor under fire. His men trusted him completely, and that trust would soon be tested to its very limits. As dawn approached, the sounds of preparation echoed through both camps. Soldiers cleaned their rifles, checked their ammunition, and wrote what might be their final letters home. The veterans among them recognized the signs, the nervous laughter that came too icily, the way men lingered over their morning coffee, the silent prayers offered when they thought no one was watching. Battle was coming, and everyone could feel it in the air like an approaching thunderstorm. The strategic situation was complex and dangerous. Rosecrans had spread his army across a wide front, believing that Bragg was retreating toward Atlanta. Instead, the Confederate commander had concentrated his forces and was preparing to strike the scattered Union columns before they could reunite. Only swift action and steady nerves would prevent a disaster that could potentially lose the war for the Union. According to historical accounts from the official records of the War of the Rebellion, Thomas had spent the night of September 17th studying maps and coordinating with his division commanders. He understood that his corps would likely bear the brunt of any Confederate assault, positioned as it was on the Army's left flank near the creek that gave the battle its ominous name. The first shots rang out just after dawn, echoing through the forest like thunder. Skirmishers from both armies had made contact near Reed's Bridge, and the sound sent a chill through every man who heard it. Thomas mounted his horse and rode toward the sound of the guns, knowing that the next few days would determine not only his own fate, but the fate of the entire Union war effort in the Western theater. The Battle of Chickamauga had begun. The Georgia wilderness exploded into chaos as Confederate forces under Brigadier General Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry struck the Union right flank with devastating precision. Through the thick undergrowth and towering pines, the rattle of musketry created a deadly symphony that would crescendo throughout the day. Thomas received urgent dispatches from Rosecrans' headquarters. The army was under a coordinated attack along multiple points, and the situation was rapidly deteriorating. By mid-morning, Thomas had deployed his divisions in a defensive line stretching from the Lafayette Road eastward toward Chickamauga Creek. The terrain favored the defenders' thick woods that channeled attacking forces into killing fields, scattered clearings that provided fields of fire for his artillery. Major General John Palmer's 1st Division held the left, while Brigadier General Absalom Byrd's division anchored the center. The men dug in quickly, using fallen logs and hastily constructed breastworks to create defensive positions. The Confederate assault came in waves, each more ferocious than the last. Bragg had divided his army into wings under Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk and Lieutenant General Daniel Harvey Hill, with Longstreet's corps arriving throughout the day to reinforce the attack. The rebel yell echoed through the forest as gray-clad soldiers charged through the underbrush, their battle flags visible through the gun smoke that began to blanket the battlefield. Thomas rode the length of his line constantly, peering wherever the fighting was heaviest. His calm presence under fire inspired his men and helped steady formations that might otherwise have broken under the intense pressure. When Colonel John Beatty's brigade came under severe attack near the Brotherton farm, Thomas personally directed the deployment of artillery that broke up the Confederate assault just as it seemed ready to break through. The fighting was particularly acutely savage around the Vineyard Farm, where Union and Confederate forces collided in a series of attacks and counterattacks that left the ground carpeted with casualties. The thick forest made coordination difficult for both sides, leading to confused melees where units stumbled into each other at point-blank range. The sound of battle was deafening, the crash of musket volleys, the screams of wounded men, the shouted orders of officers trying to maintain control in the chaos. As afternoon wore into evening, Thomas received disturbing reports from across the battlefield. Major General Alexander McCook's 20th Corps on the right had been severely mauled and was falling back in disorder. Major General Thomas Crittenden's 21st Corps in the center was under heavy pressure and requesting reinforcements. Only Thomas's 14th Corps seemed to be holding its ground against the Confederate onslaught. The true test came near sunset when Hill's Corps launched a massive assault against Thomas's left flank. Wave after wave of Confederate infantry emerged from the forest, their bayonets glinting in the fading light. The Union line bent, but did not break. As Thomas shifted reserves to threaten points and coordinated the fire of his artillery batteries to maximum effect, fighting continued until darkness mercifully ended the carnage. As night fell over the battlefield, Thomas established his headquarters in a small cabin near the Poe farm. The day's casualties had been enormous on both sides. Thousands of men lay dead or wounded in the dark forest. But Thomas knew that the real test was yet to come. Intelligence reports suggested that Longstreet's entire corps had arrived during the day, giving Bragg a significant advantage in numbers. Tomorrow would bring renewed attacks, and the survival of the Army of the Cumberland hung in the balance. The general spent the night planning defensive positions and coordinating with his subordinate commanders, knowing that September 19th would be a day that would test every ounce of courage and skill his army possessed. September 19th, 1863 dawned gray and ominous, with the acrid smell of gunpowder still hanging heavy in the morning air. Thomas had spent the sleepless night repositioning his corps and preparing for what he knew would be an even more desperate struggle than the previous day's fighting. Confederate campfires dotted the forest like fallen stars, clear indication that Bragg's army had been reinforced and was preparing for a renewed assault. The battle resumed at first light with a thunderous artillery barrage that shook the earth and sent wounded men screaming from their makeshift shelters. Polk's wing struck first, hitting the Union left with a coordinated assault that Thomas had anticipated. His defensive preparations proved their worth as Confederate attackers found themselves channeled into carefully prepared killing zones where Union artillery and massed rifle fire exacted a terrible toll. But the real crisis came at mid-morning when a tragic miscommunication nearly destroyed the Army of the Cumberland. Rosecrans, believing there was a gap in his line, ordered Brigadier General Thomas Wood to move his division to support the left. Wood's withdrawal created an actual gap just as Longstreet launched his main assault with 8 brigades concentrated on a narrow front. The Confederate breakthrough was swift and devastating, splitting the Union Army and sending 2/3 of it fleeing toward Chattanooga in complete disorder. Thomas, positioned on Snodgrass Hill with the remnants of his corps and scattered units from other commands, suddenly found himself virtually alone on the battlefield. Around him, the sounds of Confederate victory echoed through the forest, the rebel yell of advancing infantry, the thunder of artillery being brought forward, the triumphant shouts of officers rallying their men for the final assault that would complete the destruction of the Union Army. It was at this moment that George Henry Thomas earned his immortal nickname. Standing in his stirrups, the Virginia-born general surveyed the chaos around him and made a decision that would echo through history. Rather than joining the retreat, he would make his stand here on this hill, buying precious time for the scattered Union forces to regroup and escape complete annihilation. His aides suggested withdrawal, but Thomas shook his head grimly. "This corps will hold its ground," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. The defense of Snodgrass Hill became one of the most heroic stands in American military history. Thomas had perhaps 15,000 men from various shattered commands, his own 14th Corps divisions, remnants of the Reserve Corps under Major General Gordon Granger, who had marched to the sound of the guns, and scattered regiments from other units that had rallied to his position. Against them, Bragg was preparing to hurl the bulk of his victorious army. Historical records from the National Archives indicate that Thomas personally directed the placement of every artillery piece and infantry regiment during these crucial hours. He seemed to be everywhere at once, encouraging wavering soldiers, directing the fire of his guns, and coordinating the desperate defense that was all that stood between Bragg and complete victory. The Confederate assaults came in relentless waves throughout the afternoon. Each attack seemed certain to overwhelm the thin Union line, but somehow Thomas and his men held on. The hill became a fortress of the desperate, where Union soldiers fought with the fury of men who knew they were making their last stand. The ground grew slick with blood, and the air became so thick with smoke that men could barely see their targets, firing by sound and instinct into the gray masses that kept surging up the slopes toward their positions. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Snodgrass Hill as Confederate forces prepared for what appeared to be the final assault against Thomas's makeshift fortress. The Union position resembled a battered ship in a hurricane-shot, torn flags still flying defiantly above hastily constructed breastworks, while smoke from countless rifle barrels created an artificial fog of war that obscured friend and foe alike. Thomas rode his horse slowly along the defensive line, his calm presence serving as an anchor for men who were rapidly running out of ammunition and hope. Longstreet's corps had regrouped after their spectacular breakthrough and was now preparing to deliver the coup de grace. Fresh Confederate brigades moved through the forest below, their battle lines dressed as if on parade despite the carnage they had already witnessed. The rebel yell began low and menacing, building to a crescendo that sent chills through even the most veteran Union soldiers crouched behind their improvised fortifications. The first major assault came from the southeast, where Brigadier General Bushrod Johnson's division emerged from the woods in perfect formation. Their advance was magnificent and terrifying, a gray tide of bayonets and battle flags that seemed certain to sweep away everything in its path. Thomas calmly directed the fire of his artillery, waiting until the attackers were within canister range before giving the order to fire. The effect was devastating, tearing great gaps in the Confederate ranks and sending survivors stumbling back into the forest, but there was no time to celebrate. Even as Johnson's men retreated, fresh attacks materialized from multiple directions. Major General John Bell Hood's division struck the northern face of the hill while remnants of earlier assaults regrouped for another attempt from the west. Thomas found himself conducting a desperate symphony of destruction, coordinating the fire of his remaining artillery pieces and shifting his infantry to meet each new threat as it developed. The fighting reached a crescendo when Confederate forces managed to penetrate the Union line near the Kelly farmhouse. For several terrifying minutes, it appeared that the position would be overrun as gray-clad soldiers poured through the breach, their officers urging them forward with sword and pistol. Thomas personally led a counterattack composed of his staff officers, orderlies, and anyone else who could hold a rifle. The hand-to-hand fighting was savage and brief, ending only when the last Confederate penetration was eliminated at bayonet point. As the battle raged, Thomas received increasingly desperate messages from fleeing Union commanders. Rosecrans himself had been swept up in the rout and was falling back toward Chattanooga, convinced that his army was destroyed. McCook and Crittenden were attempting to rally their scattered commands, but both corps had essentially ceased to exist as organized fighting units. Only Thomas's stubborn defense prevented Bragg from pursuing the retreating Union forces and turning defeat into complete disaster. The most critical moment came near 4 o'clock, when Bragg committed his final reserves in a massive assault designed to crush the Union position once and for all. Nearly 20,000 Confederate soldiers advanced in 3 separate columns, their approach coordinated to strike simultaneously from different directions. The sound of their advance was like thunder rolling through the forest, the tramp of thousands of feet, the rattle of equipment, and the growing roar of voices raised in the rebel yell. Thomas watched the approaching storm with the detachment of a professional soldier who had accepted his fate. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, his men were falling by the dozens, and there was no prospect of reinforcement or relief. Yet he showed no sign of wavering, instead moving among his troops with words of encouragement and tactical adjustments that might buy them a few more precious minutes, according to battlefield correspondence preserved in the Library of Congress. One of his officers asked if they should prepare to surrender, to which Thomas replied simply, "We die here before we yield this hill." The final assault broke against the Union line like a wave against granite, but the defenders paid a terrible price for their continued resistance. Just as the Confederate assault seemed certain to overwhelm Thomas's exhausted defenders, sound of Union artillery echoed from the north, a sound so unexpected that both armies paused in their deadly work to listen. Major General Gordon Granger had made a decision that would prove as crucial as Thomas's stand itself, defying direct orders to remain in reserve. He had marched his reserve corps toward the sound of battle, arriving at Snodgrass Hill just as the situation reached its most desperate point. Granger's intervention came at the perfect moment. His relatively fresh brigades, numbering about 4,000 men, struck the Confederate left flank, just as Longstreet's exhausted forces were preparing for what they hoped would be their final push. The reserve corps advanced with parade ground precision, their volleys crashing into the surprised Confederate formations like hammer blows. The psychological effect was perhaps even greater than the tactical one. Suddenly, the rebels found themselves facing fresh Union troops when they had believed victory was within their grasp. Thomas greeted Granger's arrival with characteristic understatement, simply nodding and pointing toward the most threatened section of his line. The two generals worked together seamlessly, coordinating the defense as if they had planned this moment for months, rather than meeting by chance in the crucible of battle. Granger's men took position on Thomas's right, extending the Union line and providing desperately needed reinforcement to sectors that had been stripped bare to meet earlier attacks. The fighting continued with renewed intensity as Bragg committed additional reserves to break what he now recognized as a genuinely dangerous threat to his victory. Confederate artillery, brought forward during the afternoon, began a systematic bombardment of the Union positions. The hilltop became a nightmare landscape of exploding shells, fallen trees, and wounded men crying for water that no one could provide. Yet the line held, anchored by Thomas's unshakable determination and reinforced by Granger's timely intervention. As evening approached, both commanders faced crucial decisions. Bragg had won a significant tactical victory. He controlled most of the battlefield and had inflicted severe casualties on the Union Army. However, Thomas's continued resistance was preventing him from exploiting his success. Every hour that passed allowed more Union stragglers to escape toward Chattanooga, and gave Rosecrans time to reorganize his shattered forces. The Confederate general found himself in the frustrating position of having won the battle, but being unable to complete his victory. Thomas, meanwhile, was calculating the cost of continued resistance against the strategic value of his sacrifice. His corps had been bled white during 2 days of savage fighting, and ammunition was running critically low. Many of his artillery pieces were down to their last few rounds, and some infantry regiments were reduced to searching the pockets of the dead for cartridges. Yet intelligence reports suggested that the majority of the Army of the Cumberland had successfully escaped the immediate threat of destruction, achieving the primary objective of his desperate stand. The final Confederate assault of the day came just before sunset, launched with the desperation of an army that could sense victory slipping away despite their tactical dominance. Hood's division, reinforced with elements from multiple other commands, advanced across ground that was already carpeted with the casualties from earlier attacks. The Union defenders, many of whom had not eaten since the previous day, met this final challenge with the grim determination of men who had already proven their courage. Beyond any possible doubt, the fighting reached a climax as Confederate forces managed to establish footholds at several points along the Union line. For 20 minutes, The outcome hung in the balance as small groups of soldiers fought desperate hand-to-hand. Battles among the rocks and fallen trees of Snodgrass Hill. Thomas personally led a counterattack that eliminated one penetration. Granger coordinated the artillery fire that broke up another. As darkness finally brought an end to the carnage, both sides were too exhausted to continue the struggle. Historical records from the Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park archives document this final phase as among the most intense fighting of the entire Civil War. As darkness mercifully descended over the blood-soaked battlefield, Thomas faced perhaps the most crucial decision of his military career. His position on Snodgrass Hill had become untenable. Ammunition was virtually exhausted. Casualties had reduced many regiments to company strength, and Confederate forces were beginning to infiltrate around his flanks under cover of darkness. Yet the withdrawal had to be executed with perfect precision, for any sign of panic or disorder would invite a devastating pursuit that could complete the destruction of what remained of the Army of the Cumberland. Thomas convened a hurried conference with his surviving commanders in the ruins of a small cabin that had been shattered by artillery fire. The flickering light of a single candle illuminated faces streaked with powder smoke and etched with exhaustion. Granger reported that his reserve corps, though bloodied, remained capable of covering a retreat. The division commanders provided sobering assessments of their strength. Regiments that had begun the battle with 800 men now counted fewer than 200 effective soldiers. The withdrawal plan was elegant in its simplicity and desperate in its execution. Thomas would personally command the rear guard, ensuring that every wounded man who could be moved was evacuated before the main force began its retirement. Artillery pieces too damaged to move would be spiked and abandoned, but every serviceable gun would be hauled away despite the difficulties of moving through the dark forest. Most crucially, the withdrawal had to appear orderly and deliberate rather than the beginning of a rout that would invite immediate pursuit. Beginning at midnight, the evacuation commenced with the quiet efficiency that marked veteran troops. Wounded soldiers who could walk supported those who could not, while stretcher-bearers navigated the treacherous forest paths by memory and instinct. The artillery withdrawal proved particularly challenging, as gun crews had to manhandle their pieces through thick undergrowth and across ravines. Without creating noise that would alert Confederate pickets to the movement, Thomas remained on Snodgrass Hill until the very last moment, personally verifying that no living Union soldier had been left behind. His final act before departing was to walk the abandoned breastworks one last time, paying silent tribute to the men who had died defending this obscure hill that would forever bear their sacrifice. As he mounted his horse for the ride to Chattanooga, the sounds of Confederate celebration echoed through the forest, a reminder that tactical defeat had been the price of strategic salvation. The march to Chattanooga became a testament to the discipline that Thomas had instilled in his corps through months of campaigning. Despite their exhaustion and the demoralization that might have been expected after such a devastating battle, the soldiers maintained formation and mutual support throughout the difficult nighttime withdrawal. Its stragglers were helped along by their comrades, and the column maintained cohesion even when Confederate cavalry probes attempted to harass the retreating forces. Dawn of September 20th found the remnants of Thomas's command safely within the defensive perimeter that Rosecrans was hastily constructing around Chattanooga. The reunion between Thomas and his commanding general was subdued, but most men understood that the Army of the Cumberland had survived its greatest crisis, though at an almost unbearable cost. Casualty reports would eventually reveal that the Union Army had suffered over 16,000 casualties during the two-day battle. With Thomas's corps bearing a disproportionate share of the losses, news of the battle's outcome created shockwaves throughout both the Union and Confederacy. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis initially celebrated what appeared to be the most significant Confederate victory since the early days of the war. However, as reports filtered in regarding the extent of Thomas's successful resistance, Confederate leaders began to understand that their tactical victory had failed to achieve the strategic breakthrough they desperately needed. According to contemporary newspaper accounts from the Richmond Examiner, Confederate officials privately expressed frustration that Bragg had been unable to complete the destruction of Rosecrans. Army, despite achieving such a favorable position, the battle had been won, but the war continued. And the Army of the Cumberland lived to fight another day thanks to the rock-solid defense that it earned Thomas's immortal nickname in the aftermath of Chickamauga as the Army of the Cumberland. Licked its wounds behind the fortifications of Chattanooga, the full magnitude of Thomas's achievement began to dawn on both military professionals and the general public. What had initially appeared to be an unmitigated disaster for Union arms was gradually recognized as one of the most heroic defensive actions in American military history. The man who had earned the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga, through his steadfast refusal to yield, became a symbol of Union determination in the face of seemingly impossible odds. President Abraham Lincoln, upon receiving detailed reports of the battle, immediately grasped the strategic significance of Thomas's stand. While the Army of the Cumberland had suffered grievous casualties and been forced to retreat, it remained intact as a fighting force, something that would not have been possible without the sacrifice made on Snodgrass Hill. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton recommended Thomas for promotion, recognizing that his actions had potentially saved the entire Union war effort in the Western Theater. The Confederate perspective on the battle was more complex and ultimately more frustrating. Bragg had achieved his most significant tactical victory of the war, inflicting heavy casualties on Union forces and driving them from the field. However, his inability to complete the destruction of Rosecrans' army meant that the strategic situation remained essentially unchanged. The Army of Tennessee had paid an enormous price for its victory, over 18,000 casualties. It found itself no closer to achieving Confederate war aims than before the battle began. For Thomas personally, Chickamauga marked the defining moment of his military career. His calm leadership under extreme pressure, his tactical skill in coordinating a desperate defense, and his moral courage in choosing to fight when retreat would have been understandable, all combined to elevate him to the first rank of Union commanders. The nickname the Rock of Chickamauga would follow him for the rest of his life. But more importantly, it captured an essential truth about his character that would serve the Union cause well in the battles yet to come. The soldiers who had fought under Thomas's command on Snodgrass Hill developed an almost mystical devotion to their commander. They had seen him at his best when circumstances were at their worst, and they understood that their survival had depended entirely on his refusal to accept defeat. This bond between Thomas and his men would prove crucial in subsequent campaigns. As the Army of the Cumberland rebuilt its strength and prepared for the challenges that lay ahead, the tactical lessons of Chickamauga were studied extensively by military professionals on both sides. Thomas's defensive techniques, particularly his use of terrain and coordination of combined arms, became models for defensive warfare that influenced American military doctrine for generations. The battle demonstrated that properly led and positioned forces could inflict enormous casualties on attacking formations. Even when significantly outnumbered, perhaps most significantly, Chickamauga established Thomas as one of the Union's most reliable commanders at a time when such reliability was desperately needed. His performance during the battle led directly to his appointment as commander of the Army of the Cumberland following Rosecrans' removal, a position he would hold with distinction through the remaining years of the war. The steady competence he displayed at Chickamauga would serve him well in subsequent victories at Missionary Ridge and Nashville. The Battle of Chickamauga ultimately represented a turning point in the Civil War, though not in the way either side had initially anticipated. While Bragg had won the field, Thomas's heroic defense had prevented the Confederate victory from achieving strategic significance. The Army of the Cumberland would rise from the ashes of defeat to play a crucial role in the final Union victory. Its resurrection made possible by the stubborn courage of the man who became known as the Rock of Chickamauga. In the annals of American military history, few defensive stands have achieved such lasting fame or had such profound strategic consequences as those desperate hours when George Henry Thomas and his men held the line on an obscure hill in the Georgia wilderness